Lorenzo Moretti believed the most dangerous thing in his penthouse was the Glock 19 taped beneath his mahogany desk, never suspecting that the silent woman scrubbing his floorboards was the one holding the true power of life and death in the room. When he decided to spit an insult in broken Spanish at the invisible help to impress a cartel lieutenant, he didn't just ruin a multi-million-dollar deal. He accidentally pulled the pin on a grenade he didn't even know he was holding. Thank you for sticking around with me, and welcome back, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, back to the story. The reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror was worth a fortune, or at least, the man staring back liked to think so. Lorenzo the Wolf Moretti adjusted the knot of his silk tie, a shade of crimson chosen specifically to suggest power, aggression, and perhaps a subtle hint of danger. In reality, it just made his face look slightly flushed, like a toddler who had been holding his breath for too long. He stood in the center of the Obsidian Towers penthouse suite, 70 stories above the grime and noise of Manhattan. From here, the yellow taxis looked like Skittles spilled on gray concrete. The world was small. He was big. That was the narrative Lorenzo told himself every morning at 6 a.m., right after his protein shake and right before his daily affirmations. You are the apex, Lorenzo whispered to the glass, flexing his jaw. He had the facial structure of a Roman statue that had been softened by 3 generations of wealth and zero manual labor. You are the wolf. They are the sheep. Today you eat. He turned sharply, expecting the movement to look cinematic. It just looked twitchy. In the far corner of the room, near a Ming vase that cost more than a starter home in Ohio, a woman was on her hands and knees. Gabriella was invisible. It was a skill she had perfected over years of practice, a survival mechanism that had served her well in environments far more hostile than a sterilized New York penthouse. She was a black woman with skin the color of deep espresso, and hair pulled back into a severe, tight bun that allowed no stray strands to escape. She wore the generic gray uniform of the cleaning agency, a shapeless, unflattering thing that smelled faintly of industrial lemon cleaner and despair. To Lorenzo, she was a texture. She was part of the furniture, less interesting than the leather sofa and significantly cheaper to replace. He didn't know her last name. He wasn't entirely sure he knew her first name. He thought it might be Maria, or maybe Gloria. It didn't matter. NPCs didn't need names. They just needed to pathfind around the room without bumping into the protagonist. Hey, Lorenzo barked, snapping his fingers. He didn't look at her, his eyes scanning his iPad for the latest fluctuating crypto numbers. You. Cleaner. Gabriella paused in her scrubbing. She didn't flinch. She slowly sat back on her heels, keeping her eyes fixed on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. Yes, sir. Her voice was soft and heavily accented, a carefully constructed mask of subservience. The ice bucket, Lorenzo said, gesturing vaguely toward the wet bar. It needs to be full. Cubed, not crushed. If I see crushed ice when Diego gets here, I'm deducting it from your agency fee. Do you understand? Comprende? Ice. Hello. Yes, sir. Hello. Cubed. Gabriella nodded, her face a blank canvas. She returned to the floor, her movements rhythmic and hypnotic. Lorenzo snorted, turning back to his reflection. Hard to find good help, he muttered to himself, loud enough for her to hear but not caring if she did. Brainless. They just want the check. If Lorenzo had bothered to look, really look, he might have noticed that the woman's hands were not rough and calloused like someone who had spent a lifetime scrubbing floors. He might have noticed that her manicured fingernails, though cut short and unpolished, were pristine. He might have noticed the Rolex on her wrist was fake, but the intelligence in her eyes was razor-sharp and terrifyingly real. But Lorenzo Moretti was a man who only looked at things he wanted to possess or destroy, and a maid fell into neither category. He walked over to the massive oak desk that dominated the room. It had belonged to his father, Giacomo the Hammer Moretti. Giacomo had been a terrifying figure in the underworld, a man who could silence a room just by clearing his throat. Lorenzo, having inherited the empire 6 months ago after his father's sudden cardiac arrest, was discovering that fear was not hereditary. He sat in the oversized leather chair, which swallowed him slightly, and opened the drawer. He checked the gold-plated pistol, ensuring a round was chambered. It was a prop mostly. Lorenzo had never fired a gun in anger. He preferred to let his bodyguards, Rocco and Vinny, handle the messy parts of the business. "Rocco!" Lorenzo shouted. The double doors swung open, and 2 mountains of meat squeezed through the frame. Rocco and Vinny were identical in their baldness and their inability to find suits that fit their shoulders. They looked like fire hydrants wearing tuxedos. "Yeah, boss." Rocco grunted, chewing on a toothpick. "Is the car here? Is Rojas downstairs?" Lorenzo asked, his voice pitching up slightly. He cleared his throat, dropping it back to a baritone. "I want everything perfect. The Colombians smell weakness like sharks smell blood. If this deal goes through, we control the port. We control the East Coast." "Car's 5 minutes out," Vinny said, checking his phone. "Traffic on the FDR." "Good," Lorenzo said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. It was tight. He sucked in his stomach. "Rojas thinks he's dealing with a kid. He thinks that because I went to business school, I don't know the streets. I'm going to show him. I'm going to speak his language." Rocco exchanged a look with Vinny. "Are you sure about that, boss? We got a translator on retainer." "That guy, Stefano? He's good." "No translator," Lorenzo snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. The vibration made a crystal decanter shiver. "Translators make you look weak. Dependent. A king speaks to a king directly. I've been practicing. I've got the app." Gabriella, over by the bar now, carefully placing ice cubes into a silver bucket with tongs, paused for a fraction of a second. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, gone before anyone could witness it. "Besides," Lorenzo continued, pacing the room, his Italian leather shoes clicking sharply, "how hard can it be? Hola, amigo. Plata o plomo. I watched the show. I know the rhythm." He stopped in front of the bar, looming over Gabriella. He grabbed a bottle of scotch, pouring himself a generous measure despite it being 10 in the morning. He needed the liquid courage. "You," he said, looking down at the top of Gabriella's head. "When the guest arrives, you stay out of the way. You come in, you pour the drinks, you change the ashtrays, and you leave. You don't look at him. You don't look at me. You are a ghost. Phantasma. Understand?" Gabriella looked up. Her eyes were dark, bottomless pools. For a split second, Lorenzo felt a chill crawl up his spine, a primal warning signal that he was standing too close to a predator. But then she blinked, and the sensation vanished, replaced by the dull, cow-eyed look of a servant. "See, Signor Moretti," she whispered. "I am a ghost." "Good." Lorenzo took a swig of the scotch. It burned, but he didn't cough. At least one person here knows their place. He turned back to his bodyguards. "Get the room ready. Lower the AC. I want it freezing in here. Make him uncomfortable. Cold makes people want to leave and makes them agree to terms faster just to get out. It's a psychological tactic." "It's like a meat locker in here already, boss," Rocco complained, rubbing his massive arms. "Do it," Lorenzo barked. As Rocco moved to the thermostat, Gabriella finished with the ice bucket. She placed it on the center table, exactly 3 inches from the edge, aligned perfectly with the coasters. She checked her pocket to ensure her digital recorder was still running. It had been recording for 3 weeks. Every phone call, every tantrum, and every incriminating admission Lorenzo Moretti had made was stored on a drive the size of a fingernail. She adjusted her apron, her mind running through the variables. Diego Rojas was coming. She knew Diego. They had worked together in Juarez 4 years ago. He was sharp, ruthless, and observant. He wouldn't be fooled by Lorenzo's posturing. The question was, would Diego recognize her? She had changed her hair, gained 10 pounds, and altered her posture, but her eyes were harder to disguise. She would have to be careful. She needed the deal to be verbally confirmed before she could make her move. She needed Lorenzo to hang himself with his own tongue. The intercom on the desk buzzed. "Mr. Moretti," the concierge's voice crackled. Mr. Rojas is in the elevator. He's coming up. Lorenzo stiffened. He downed the rest of the scotch in one gulp and slammed the glass down. "Showtime," Lorenzo said, exhaling sharply. "Rocco, Vinny, stand by the door. Look menacing. Cleaner. Get in the corner and stay there until I signal for drinks." Gabriella moved silently to her station by the service entrance, folding her hands in front of her apron. She lowered her head, casting her eyes to the floor, assuming the position of the invisible woman. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Lorenzo spread his arms wide, pasting a smile on his face that was all teeth and no warmth. "Diego, mi amigo, welcome to my kingdom," Lorenzo shouted, his voice booming off the glass walls. Diego Rojas stepped out of the elevator. He was a compact man, dressed in a suit that cost more than Lorenzo's car, cut to fit him like a second skin. He didn't smile. He didn't look at the view. He didn't look at the bodyguards. He walked straight toward Lorenzo, his eyes scanning the room with the efficiency of a Terminator. And then, for a brief, terrifying moment, his gaze flicked to the corner, landing on the maid with the dark skin and the gray uniform. He paused, his stride faltering for a nanosecond. Gabriella didn't move. She didn't breathe. Diego looked away, focusing back on Lorenzo. "Mr. Moretti," Diego said, his voice smooth and deep, his English perfect. "You have a lovely home." "It's a palace, Diego." "A palace," Lorenzo laughed, grabbing Diego's hand and shaking it too hard. "But please, no English. Today we speak as brothers. En español." Diego raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure, Lorenzo? My English is quite good." No, I insist," Lorenzo said, guiding him toward the table. "I want to show you respect. Respeto." From her corner, Gabriella watched the train wreck begin to unfold in slow motion. Lorenzo was leading a wolf into his den, thinking it was a dog he could train. He had no idea that the only thing protecting him from being eaten alive was the woman he had just called brainless. Lorenzo sat down, crossing his legs, and leaned forward. "So, Diego, let's talk business. Hablamos negocios." The arrogance in the room was thick enough to choke on. Lorenzo Moretti was a man who believed the world owed him everything just because he was born. It was the kind of entitlement that made the blood boil. If you despise people who treat service workers like trash, hit subscribe. Only the entitled and the bullies will scroll past. The air conditioning in the penthouse was humming with the aggressive intensity of a jet engine, chilling the room to a temperature that made the expensive leather chairs stiff and unyielding. Lorenzo Moretti sat at the head of the glass table, shivering slightly inside his bespoke Italian suit, though he tried to pass the tremors off as brimming masculine energy. Across from him, Diego Rojas sat perfectly still. The Colombian lieutenant hadn't touched his drink. He wore a light wool jacket that seemed perfectly suited for the Arctic microclimate Lorenzo had engineered. Diego looked comfortable. Lorenzo looked like a man trying to sell ice to a polar bear while freezing to death. "Entonces," Lorenzo began, leaning forward and clasping his hands. He had practiced this phrase in the mirror for 20 minutes. "Nosotros hacer el negocio grande." "Sí." Diego stared at him. The silence stretched out, long and painful. Finally, Diego picked up his glass of scotch, swirled it, and spoke in English. "Lorenzo, we can speak English. It is fine. My English is better than your Spanish." No. Lorenzo waved a hand dismissively, knocking a coaster off the table. "Is respect, Diego. Respeto. I learn your tongue. Show me I am serious. Yo soy muy serios." Lorenzo beamed. He felt like a diplomat. He was bridging cultures. He was a global citizen. "Okay," Diego said, his face unreadable. "Continue." Lorenzo took a deep breath. He needed to articulate the terms for the port of Newark. The Moretti family controlled the dock unions. The cartel had the product. It was a simple equation, but Lorenzo wanted a bigger slice of the pie. He wanted 60%. He was prepared to settle for 40, but he had to start high. Nosotros, Lorenzo pointed to himself, then to the ceiling, indicating his vast empire. Queremos 60% del polvo. Diego's eyes narrowed slightly. 60. Sí, Lorenzo nodded vigorously. Why two? He pointed at Diego. Two pegas. El barco. Why, mi madre? Diego blinked. The stone-faced cartel lieutenant actually looked confused. Your mother. Lorenzo froze. He realized he'd mixed up a word. He meant la manera, the way/method. Or perhaps la madera, the wood. No, that wasn't it. He had panicked and said madre. No, no mother, Lorenzo laughed nervously, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. I mean, costs. Costos. You pay costs. I take 60. 60. Diego leaned back, crossing his legs. Lorenzo. In my country, if you ask for 60% of a man's product when you do not own the product, that man usually cuts off your tongue and mails it to your wife. But since we are friends, I will assume you are joking. The threat was delivered so calmly that Lorenzo almost missed it. He swallowed hard. The room felt suddenly smaller. The wolf was feeling very much like a poodle. Of course, joking. Broma. Lorenzo chuckled, the sound hollow. Negotiation, right? El arte del trato. Lorenzo grabbed his glass, realizing it was empty. He needed a refill. He needed a moment to think. He needed the help to do their job so he could regain his composure. He glanced toward the corner where Gabriella stood like a statue. She had been so quiet he had almost forgotten she was there, which was exactly how he liked his employees. Seen when needed, invisible when not, and preferably mute. Hey! Lorenzo snapped his fingers, the sharp sound echoing off the glass walls. Mas hielo. Why whiskey? Now. Gabriella moved immediately. She walked with a measured, efficient pace, her head bowed. She picked up the crystal decanter and approached the table. Lorenzo was angry. He was failing and he knew it. The dominant atmosphere he had tried to create was backfiring. He looked weak in front of the Colombian. He needed to reassert control. He needed to show Diego that he was the alpha in the room, even if he couldn't conjugate a verb to save his life. As Gabriella reached over the table to refill Diego's glass first, following proper service etiquette, Lorenzo shifted abruptly in his chair, throwing his arm out to emphasize a point he hadn't made yet. His elbow collided with Gabriella's arm. The decanter wobbled. A splash of amber liquid sloshed over the rim and landed on the sleeve of Lorenzo's $3,000 jacket. Time seemed to stop. Lorenzo looked at the dark spots spreading on the gray silk. It was a tiny stain, barely the size of a dime. But to Lorenzo, it was a bullet hole in his ego. He exploded. He leaped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You stupid cow, he screamed in English, before remembering his audience. He spun toward Diego, his face flushed red, desperation and rage mixing into a toxic cocktail. He needed a villain, and the maid was perfect. He pointed a trembling finger at Gabriella, who had recoiled slightly, clutching the decanter to her chest. Mira esto, Lorenzo sneered, switching to his broken, aggressive Spanish, desperate to bond with Diego over the incompetence of the servant class. Esta pequeña rata es el problema con este país. Sin cerebro torpe. En I siquiera entiende que la estoy lamando basura en su propia cara. Solo serve para limpiar mis zapatos. Look at this. This little rat is the problem with this country. Brainless. Clumsy. She doesn't even understand that I'm calling her trash to her face. She is only good for cleaning my shoes. He looked at Diego, expecting a nod of solidarity. A shared laugh between powerful men about the stupidity of the underclass. Diego didn't laugh. He raised a single eyebrow, his gaze shifting from the red-faced mob boss to the woman standing perfectly still by the table. There was a flicker of something in Diego's eyes. Not anger, but amusement. Deep, dark amusement. If you can't stand people who belittle workers to make themselves feel big, hit subscribe. Trolls and bullies can keep scrolling. We don't want you here. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to scream. Gabriella didn't apologize. She didn't scurry away to fetch a towel. She didn't start crying. Instead, she slowly reached out and placed the crystal decanter on the glass table. Clack. The sound was deliberate. It was heavy. It sounded less like a serving vessel being put down and more like a gavel striking a judge's bench. Gabriella stood up straight. It was a subtle movement, but the effect was transformative. The curve of her spine vanished. Her shoulders squared. Her chin lifted. The submissive, invisible aura she had worn like a cloak for 3 weeks evaporated instantly. In its place stood a woman who looked like she could command armies. She turned her head slowly. Her eyes, previously dull and fixed on the floor, locked onto Lorenzo's. They were cold, sharp, and terrifyingly intelligent. Lorenzo blinked, confused. The NPC had broken its programming. "En realidad, Señor Moretti," Gabriella began. Her voice was unrecognizable. Gone was the soft, mumbled accent of the immigrant maid. In its place was flawless, rapid-fire Castilian Spanish, the kind spoken in the high courts of Madrid or the boardrooms of Mexico City. It was smooth, aristocratic, and dripping with disdain. "La única basura aquí es su gramática," she continued, her voice slicing through the cold air of the room like a scalpel. "Acaba de usar el tiempo verbal incorrecto y lo ofreció al señor Rojas el 50% de su territorio. No el quince. Actually, Mr. Moretti, the only trash here is your grammar. You just used the wrong tense and offered Mr. Rojas 50% of your territory, not 15. Lorenzo's jaw dropped. His brain scrambled to process the sounds coming out of the cleaning lady. "W what?" he stammered in English. Gabriella didn't break eye contact with him, but she gestured elegantly toward Diego. "Le dijo 50, Señor Moretti. Usted confundió quince con 50. An error de principiant. An error de niño. You said 50, Mr. Moretti. You confused 15 with 50. A beginner's mistake. A child's mistake." Lorenzo's face drained of color, turning the shade of old milk. He looked at Diego. Diego was grinning now, a wide, predatory smile that showed all his teeth. Gabriella turned to the cartel lieutenant, nodding respectfully, treating him as an equal while treating Lorenzo like the furniture. "El carriadecker que respeta su tiempo, pero es demasiado arrogant para admitir que necesita un traductor," she said to Diego, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "También acaba de insultar a su madre accidentalmente cuando intentó pedir más hielo. Dijo que su madre era fría, no el hielo." He meant to say he respects your time, but he is too arrogant to admit he needs a translator. He also just accidentally insulted your mother when he tried to ask for more ice. He said your mother was cold, not the ice. Diego threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was a booming sound that shook the tension right out of the room, replacing it with Lorenzo's utter humiliation. "Madre de Dios," Diego gasped, wiping a tear from his eye. "I thought he called her a stick, but cold makes more sense. Thank you, Señora." Lorenzo looked between them, his head swiveling like a broken toy. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had inverted. The maid and the cartel boss were sharing a joke, and he was the punchline. You speak." Lorenzo pointed a shaking finger at Gabriella. "Better than you speak English, apparently." Gabriella switched to English effortlessly, her tone as dry as a martini. She smoothed the front of her generic gray apron, looking down at him with pity. "And certainly better than you negotiate." "Who the hell are you?" Lorenzo whispered, the fear finally starting to seep through his confusion. You're fired." "I resign," Gabriella corrected him. She picked up the empty silver tray, tucked it under her arm, and checked her cheap plastic wristwatch. "I'll be downstairs collecting my severance pay in cash. Don't make me ask twice." She turned on her heel, her movements crisp and military, and began to walk toward the door. Lorenzo Moretti had spent his whole life thinking he was the predator. He had just realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he had locked himself in a cage with something much, much worse than a wolf. And he wasn't going to let her walk out alive. The silence that followed Gabriella's exit line was shattered by the sound of Lorenzo's ego disintegrating. For a man like Lorenzo, humiliation was worse than death. Death made you a legend. Humiliation made you a meme. He watched the back of the maid's gray uniform retreating toward the double doors, and his brain finally rebooted from shock into blind, panic-induced rage. Chapter 3. The glasshouse shatters. Grab her! Lorenzo shrieked. His voice cracked, hitting a pitch that only dogs and very disappointed fathers could hear. She's a plant. A fed. Nobody leaves this room. He slammed his hand onto the desk, pointing frantically at the door. Rocco and Vinny, who had been watching the exchange with the slack-jawed confusion of two koalas trying to do algebra, suddenly snapped into action. They were paid to hurt people, not to understand linguistic nuance. "Hey! You!" Rocco bellowed, launching himself off the wall. He moved with surprising speed for a man shaped like a vending machine. Gabriella stopped. She didn't break into a run. She didn't scream. She simply sighed, a long, weary exhale that suggested she was mentally calculating how much paperwork this was going to cause. She was 5 feet away from the heavy oak doors. Rocco was closing the distance fast, his meaty hand reaching out to grab her shoulder. "Don't touch me," Gabriella said calmly, without turning around. "I said stop." Rocco grunted, his fingers inches from her uniform. Gabriella spun. The movement was a blur. It wasn't the flailing panic of a civilian. It was the efficient, brutal choreography of someone who had trained to kill people with their bare hands. As she turned, her right hand snatched the heavy crystal decanter she had placed on the sideboard moments earlier. In one fluid motion, she swung it backward. Crash! The heavy lead crystal connected with the bridge of Rocco's nose. The decanter didn't break, but Rocco's face did. Blood sprayed across the pristine white wall like abstract art. Rocco made a sound like a deflating tire and dropped to his knees, clutching his face. Vinny, seeing his partner go down, roared and fumbled for the gun holstered under his armpit. "Bad idea, Vinny," Gabriella said. Before the gun could clear the holster, Gabriella stepped inside his guard. She was smaller, faster, and infinitely meaner. She drove the heel of her sensible rubber-soled shoe directly into Vinny's kneecap. There was a sickening pop of ligaments tearing. Vinny screamed, his leg buckling backward at an angle that legs are not supposed to bend. As he crumpled, Gabriella grabbed his wrist, the one reaching for the gun, and twisted it violently. The gun skittered across the polished floor, sliding under the sofa. Gabriella shoved Vinny aside. He collapsed next to Rocco, the two mountains of muscle reduced to a groaning pile on the floor. Lorenzo watched from behind his desk, his mouth open in silent horror. His elite security team had been neutralized in less than 6 seconds by the woman who cleaned his toilets. What are you?" Lorenzo stammered, backing up until he hit the window. Gabriella ignored him. She reached up and pulled the pins from her hair, shaking her head. Her dark, curly hair cascaded down her shoulders, softening her features but making her eyes look even wilder. She ripped off the generic gray apron and tossed it onto Rocco's unconscious form. Underneath, she wore a simple black blouse and slacks. Utilitarian, tactical. She turned to Diego Rojas, who was still sitting at the table. He hadn't moved. He was calmly sipping his scotch, watching the violence with the appreciation of a man watching a good opera. "Diego," Gabriella said, her voice commanding. "Tell him." Lorenzo looked at the Colombian lieutenant. "Tell me what?" "Shoot her. She's crazy." Diego stood up slowly. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate care. He looked at Lorenzo with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Lorenzo," Diego said, his voice grave, "you thought you were negotiating with me. But I do not have the authority to approve a 50% territory split. I do not even have the authority to approve a lunch order." Lorenzo blinked. "What? You're the lieutenant. You're the wolf of Medellin." "I am a messenger," Diego said, shaking his head. He walked over to Gabriella and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of genuine deference. "She is the wolf." Lorenzo looked at Gabriella. The maid. The cleaning lady. I don't understand, Lorenzo whispered. Gabriella reached into the pocket of her slacks and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. She lit one with a silver lighter she had swiped from Vinny's pocket during the scuffle. She took a long drag, exhaling a plume of blue smoke toward the ceiling. I'm not the maid, Lorenzo, she said, her voice dropping an octave, shedding the last remnants of the servant persona. I'm la auditora. The auditor. Lorenzo felt his knees go weak. He had heard the name. Everyone in the underworld had heard the name. La Auditora was a ghost story that criminals told each other. She was the one the cartels sent when the books didn't balance, or when a new partner needed to be vetted. She didn't just check the numbers. She checked the soul of the operation. You run logistics? Lorenzo asked, his voice trembling. I run everything north of the border for the Sinaloa Federation, Gabriella corrected him. Diego works for me. We needed to know if the Moretti family was competent enough to handle our distribution. We needed to know if you were smart, if you were disciplined, and most importantly. She walked toward him. Lorenzo shrank back against the glass. We needed to know how you treat people when you think no one of consequence is watching. She stopped 2 feet from him. She smelled of tobacco and expensive soap, not lemon pledge. You failed the audit, Lorenzo, she said softly. You have no discipline. You treat your staff like garbage. You let your ego drive your negotiations. And your Spanish is atrocious. Lorenzo scrambled for the desk drawer. The gun. He had a gun. I'm the boss. Lorenzo screamed, fumbling for the gold-plated pistol. I am the king. He raised the gun, his hand shaking so badly the barrel vibrated. Gabriella didn't flinch. She just looked at the gun, then back at his face. Safety, she said. What? The safety is on, she pointed to the side of the pistol. Lorenzo looked down. In that split second of distraction, Diego moved. He didn't need to be fast. Lorenzo was just that slow. Diego slapped the gun out of Lorenzo's hand. It flew across the room and hit the carpet with a dull thud. Gabriella stepped forward and slapped Lorenzo across the face. It wasn't a fist. It was an open-handed slap of pure disrespect. It stung more than a punch. Sit down, she ordered. Lorenzo sat. He fell into his chair, defeated. Diego, we're done here, Gabriella said, turning away. Burn the deal. Blacklist the Moretti family from all ports south of Miami. If they want to move product, they can swim it across the Atlantic. Understood, Patrona, Diego said. Gabriella walked toward the elevator. She paused at the door, looking back at the wreckage of the room. The unconscious bodyguards, the spilled scotch, the terrified king in his oversized chair. And Lorenzo, she called out. Lorenzo looked up, tears of rage and fear stinging his eyes. Next time you want to insult someone in a foreign language, she said, a small, sharp smile playing on her lips. Use Google Translate. It's free. The elevator doors chimed. She stepped in, followed by Diego. As the doors closed, Lorenzo was left alone in his cold, silent penthouse, realizing that while he had been playing a gangster, the real gangster had been emptying his trash cans for 3 weeks. 3 months later, the Moretti family empire had crumbled. Without the Newark ports, their revenue dried up. The unions turned on them. The other families circled like sharks. Lorenzo the Wolf Moretti was forced to sell the penthouse. He ended up working at a car rental agency near JFK Airport. One rainy Tuesday, a woman in a sharp business suit walked up to the counter. Lorenzo, wearing a cheap polyester uniform with a name tag that sat crooked on his chest, didn't look up from his computer. Name? He grunted. Gabriella, the woman said. Lorenzo froze. He looked up. It was her. Her hair was down, her suit was Armani, and she looked like a queen. I need a car, she said, her eyes twinkling with recognition. Something fast. And make sure it's clean. I hate a dirty car. Lorenzo swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he typed. Yes, ma'am, he whispered. Right away. Gabriella took the keys. She leaned in close. Much better, she whispered in Spanish. Mucho mejor. She walked away, leaving Lorenzo standing there, listening to the sound of her heels clicking on the floor, a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a gavel banging shut. The end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out.